In this video, we're going to explore conditional page breaks for Microsoft Word and Excel in Mail and Deploy. Let's jump directly into a Word report. The first question is, when do we need a conditional page break? A typical scenario is when working with repeaters. Imagine that you have a repeater and you want each repeated block to start on a new page. If you use a normal page break, you will usually get the correct result for the individual sections, but you may end up with an unwanted empty page at the end of the document. Have you seen this before? Maybe you have created a report where each repeated section needed to start on a new page? Let's look at an example. I will add a page break and run the preview so we can see what happens. Here we have the output. Each sales representative starts on a separate page, which is what we want. However, we also have an empty page at the end. The reason is that the page break is applied after every repetition, including the last one. But after the last sales representative, we do not need another page break. This is exactly the situation where we need a conditional page break. The logic is simple. We want the page break between the repeated elements, but we want to skip it after the final element. Let's see how we can implement this. The first thing we need is a counter using a local variable. I initialize the counter with the value 1. The second thing we need is the total number of repetitions. In this example, the total number of sales representatives. One important point, the calculation of the total must happen after the filters. This is a common mistake. If you calculate the total before applying the filters, the number of repetitions will not be correct. The correct sequence is: first apply the filters, for example, region, month, and year. Then calculate the counter and the total number of sales representatives. Now we know exactly how many sales representatives will be displayed in the report. The next step is updating the counter during the repetition. For this example, I place the counter update in the preparation actions of the label, displaying the sales representative name. Let's look at this in a debugging example. I will display the counter so we can follow the value. Now we can see the counter increasing with each repetition. If we change the region to one with more sales representatives, we can see how the counter behaves with additional records. Remember, the counter is updated when the element is processed. This is why the value increases by 1 after each repetition. The important thing is to understand where the counting happens and how the condition is defined. The initial value of the counter can be 0 or 1. In this example, I start with 1. The condition needs to match this choice. Once you display the counter, the logic becomes much easier to follow. The same approach can be applied to any repeating dimension. Here, the repeating dimension is the sales representative name, so the total number of repetitions is the number of sales representatives. So to summarize, for Word, the key point is that a conditional page break allows you to add page breaks between repeated elements without creating an unnecessary empty page at the end. The main steps are to create a counter, calculate the total number of repetitions after applying filters, and use this information in the page break condition. Now let's move to Excel. The Excel example is a little more complex because of the way Mail and Deploy handles repeaters behind the scenes. The basic idea is the same, but the implementation is slightly different. Here we are working with a repeater that creates multiple tables. Let's generate the output first, because it is easier to understand when we see the result. Here we have several tables repeated based on a dimension. This dimension controls the repetition. The goal is to control how many tables are placed on each page. Of course, the tables are dynamic, but based on the data structure, we can estimate how many tables will fit on one page. The challenge is that we do not want a table to be split across 2 pages. For example, we do not want the beginning of a table at the bottom of one page and the rest of the table continuing on the next page. To control this, we can define the number of tables per page using a local variable. For example, after testing the output, we may decide that 3 tables per page provide the best result. The advantage is that we only need to change one variable and the page layout adjusts accordingly. Now let's look at the logic behind it. For this example, we need 3 values: the number of tables per page, then the current counter, and the total number of repetitions. Just like in the word example, the total number of repetitions is calculated after filtering by using a count distinct on the repeating dimension. This tells us how many tables will be generated in total. The counter is then increased each time a table is displayed. The most important part is the page break formula. At first glance, it may look a little complicated because it uses the modulo calculation. Let's open the debugging version because this makes the logic much easier to understand. Once we see how the counter changes during the repetition, the formula becomes much clearer. So for Excel, the concept is similar, but the calculation is slightly more advanced because we are controlling repeated tables. By using counters and defining how many tables should fit on one page, we can avoid unwanted page breaks and create a cleaner output. The most important thing to remember is that page break logic always depends on the repeating dimension and the way you count the repetitions. Thank you for watching.